All right, chapter 29 is called The Missions. 2 years before he hauled the bombs into the Colulmbine cafeteria, Eric took a crucial step. He had always maintained an active fantasy life. His extinction fantasies progressed steadily, but reality held firm and was completely separate from his fantasy life. Then one day, midway through sophomore year, Eric began to take action. He wasn't angry, cruel, or particularly hateful. His campaign against the inferiors was comically banal, but it was real. The mischief started as a threesome. Dylan and Zach were co-conspirators and squad mates. In his written accounts, Eric referred to the two by their code names, Vodka and Kibbs. They launched the escapades in January 1997, second semester of their sophomore year. They would meet at Eric's house mostly, sneak out after midnight, and vandalize houses of kids he didn't like. Eric chose the targets, of course. They had to be careful sneaking out. They couldn't wake his parents. Lots of rocks to navigate in Eric's backyard, and a pesky neighbor's dog kept barking its falking head off, Eric wrote. Then they plunged into a field of tall grass he compared to Jurassic Park's Lost World. To Eric, it was one hell of an adventure. He had been role-playing Marine heroes on military maneuvers since grade school. Finally, he was in the field, conducting them. Eric dubbed his pranks the missions. As they got underway, he ruminated about misfit geniuses in American society. He didn't like what he saw. Eric was a voracious reader, and he had just gobbled up John Steinbeck's The Pastures of Heaven, which includes a fable about the idiot savant Tula-Recito. The young boy had extraordinary gifts that allowed him to see a world his peers couldn't even imagine, exactly how Eric was coming to view himself, though without Tula-Recito's mental shortcomings. Tula-Recito's peers failed to see his gifts and treated him badly. Tula-Recito struck back violently, killing one of his antagonists. He was imprisoned for life in an insane asylum. Eric did not approve. Tula-Recito did not deserve to be put away, he wrote in a book report. He just needed to be taught to control his anger. Society needs to treat extremely talented people like Tula-Recito much better. All they needed was more time, Eric argued. Gifted misfits could be taught what was right and wrong, what was acceptable to society. Love and care is the only way, he said. Love and care. Eric wrote this at the very moment he started moving against his peers. Sometimes he attacked their houses to retaliate for perceived slights, but most often for the offense of inferiority. Between missions, the boys got into unscripted trouble. Eric got mad at Brooks Brown and stopped talking to him. Then he escalated a snowball fight by breaking a chunk of ice off a drain pipe. He hurled it at the car of a friend of Brooks's and dented the trunk. He grabbed another hunk and cracked the windshield of Brooks's Mercedes. "Fuck you!" Brooks screamed. "You're going to pay for this!" Eric laughed. "Kiss my ass, Brooks. I ain't paying for shit." Brooks drove home and told his mom. Then he headed to Eric's. He was furious, but Kathy Harris remained calm. She invited Brooks in and gave him a seat in the living room. Brooks knew lots of Eric's secrets, and he spilled them all. "Your son's been sneaking out at night," he said. "He's going around vandalizing things." Kathy seemed incredulous. She tried to calm the kid down. Brooks kept ranting. "He's got liquor in his room. Search it. He's got spray paint cans. Search it." She wanted him to talk, but he felt that he was acting like a school counselor, that she was acting like a school counselor. He was out of there, he said. He was getting out before Eric got back. Brooks went home and discovered his friend had grabbed Eric's backpack, taking it hostage, more or less. Brooks' mom, Judy, took control of the situation. She ordered everyone into her car and brought them to see Eric. He was still enjoying the snowball fight. "Lock the doors," Judy demanded. She rolled her window down a crack and yelled over to Eric. "I've got your backpack and I'm taking it to your mom's. Meet us over there." Eric grabbed hold of the car and screamed ferociously. When she pulled away, he hung on, wailing harder. Eric reminded her of an escaped animal attacking a car at a wildlife theme park. Brooks's friend shifted to the other side of the back seat. Judy was terrified. They had never seen this side of Eric. They were used to Dylan's tirades, but he was all show. Eric looked like he meant it. That's the first part of number 8 on chapter 29. Judy got up enough speed, and Eric let go. At his house, Eric's mom greeted them in the driveway. Judy handed her the backpack and unloaded the story. Kathy began to cry. Judy felt bad. Kathy had always been so sweet. Wayne came home and threw the fear of God into Eric. He interrogated him about the alcohol, but Eric had it hidden and played innocent convincingly. He wasn't taking any chances, though. As soon as he got a chance, he destroyed the stash. I had to ditch every bottle I had and lie like a fucking salesman to my parents, he wrote. That night, he went with the confessional approach. He admitted a weakness to his dad. The truth was, he was afraid of Mrs. Brown. That explained a lot, Wayne thought. Kathy wanted to hear more from the Browns. Wayne bitterly resented their interference. Who was this hysterical woman, or her conniving little brat, Brooks? Wayne was hard enough on the boys without outsiders telling them how to raise his sons. Kathy called Judy that night. Judy felt she really wanted to listen, but Wayne was negative and dismissive in the background. It was kid stuff, he insisted. It was all blown way out of proportion. He got on the line and told Judy that Eric had copped to the truth. He was afraid of her. Your son isn't afraid of me, Judy said. He came after me at my car. There's the second part of number 8. Wayne jotted notes about the exchange on a green steno pad. He outlined Eric's misdeeds, including getting in Judy Brown's face and, quote, being a little bully. At the bottom of the page, he summarized. He found Eric guilty of aggression, disrespect, property damage, and idle threats of physical harm. But he did not look kindly on the Browns. Overreaction to minor incident, he concluded. He dated it February 28, 1997. At school the next day, Brooks heard Eric was making threats about him. He told his parents that night. They called the cops. A deputy came by to question them and then went to see the Harrises. Wayne called a few minutes later. He was bringing Eric over to apologize. Judy told Brooks and his brother Aaron to hide. I want you both in the back bedroom, she said, and don't come out. Wayne waited in the car. He refused to supply moral support. Eric had to walk up to the door and face Mr. and Mrs. Brown alone. Eric had regained his normal composure. He was exceptionally contrite. Mrs. Brown, I didn't mean any harm, he said, and you know I would never do anything to hurt Brooks. You can pull the wool over your dad's eyes, she said, but you can't pull the wool over my eyes. Eric gaped. Are you calling me a liar? Yes, I am. And if you ever come up our street, or if you ever do anything to Brooks again, I'm calling the police. Eric left in a huff. He went home and plotted revenge. He was wary now, but he wouldn't back down. The next mission target was the Browns' house. The team also hit random houses. Mostly they would set off fireworks, toilet paper the places, or trigger a house alarm. They also stuck silly putty to Brooks's Mercedes. Eric had been bragging about the missions on his website, and at this point, he posted Brooks's name, address, and phone number. He encouraged readers to harass this asshole. Brooks had betrayed Eric. Brooks had to be punished, but he was never significant. Eric had bigger ideas. He was experimenting with timers now, and those offered new opportunities. Eric wired a dozen firecrackers together and attached a long fuse. He was fastidiously analytical, but he had no way to access his data because he fled as soon as he lit the fuses. Judy Brown viewed Eric as a criminal in bloom. She and Randy spoke to Eric's dad repeatedly. They kept calling the cops. Wayne did not appreciate that. He would do anything to protect his son's futures. Discipline was a no-brainer, but the boys' reputations were out of his control. Every kid was going to screw up now and then. The important thing was keeping it inside the family. One black mark could wipe out a lifetime of opportunities. What was the purpose of instilling discipline if one crazy family could ruin Eric's permanent record? And so that is number 9. Wayne scrutinized Eric for a while, but ultimately he bought into his son's version. Eric was smart enough to cop to some bad behavior. His calm contrition made the Browns look hysterical. 3 days after the ice incident, Wayne was grappling with more parents and a Colulmbine dean. Wayne pulled out the 6x9-inch pad and labeled the cover Eric. He filled 3 more note pages over 2 days. Brooks knew about the missions and had gone to see a dean. The dean was concerned about alcohol consumption and damage to school property. He would get the police involved if necessary. Eric played dumb. The word denial appears in large letters on 2 consecutive pages of Wayne's journal. Both times the word is circled, but the first entry is scribbled out. Denial of even knowledge about alcohol subject between he and me, the second entry reads. Didn't know what Dean Place was talking about. Wayne concluded that the issue was over and done. Don't discuss with friends. He repeatedly stressed that silence was key. Talk to Eric. Basically, finished, he wrote. Leave each other alone. Don't talk about it. Agreed, all discussion is over with. Wayne Harris apparently breathed easier for a while. He didn't write in his journal for a month and a half. Then came 4 rapid entries documenting a slew of phone calls. First, Wayne talked to Zach's mom and another parent. The next day, 2 years and 1 day before the massacre, a deputy from the Jeffco Sheriff's Department called. Wayne put his guard up. "We feel victimized too," he wrote. "We don't want to be accused every time something happens. Eric learned his lesson." But he crossed out that last phrase, that Eric learned his lesson, and wrote, "is not at fault." And there's your answer to number 10. The real problem was Brooks, Wayne was convinced. "Brooks Brown is out to get Eric," he wrote. "Brooks had problems with other boys, manipulative and con artists. If the problem continued, it might be time to hire a mediator or a lawyer." Wayne's last entry on the feud occurred a week later on April 27th after a call with Judy Brown. "Eric hadn't broken promise to Mr. Place, the dean, about leaving each other alone," he wrote. At the bottom of the page, he repeated his earlier sentiments. "We feel victimized too. Manipulative. Con artist." Eric totally rocked on the missions. Dylan enjoyed them too. He liked the camaraderie especially. He fit in there. He had a role to play. He belonged. But the missions were brief diversions. They were not making him happy. In fact, Dylan was miserable. Chapter 30, telling us why. Jeffco had a problem. Before Eric and Dylan shot themselves, officers had discovered files on the boys. The cops had 12 pages from Eric's website spewing hate and threatening to kill. For detectives, a written confession discovered before the killers were captured was a big break. It certainly simplified the search warrants. But for commanders, a public confession, which they had sat on since 1997, that could be a PR disaster. That is number 11 in chapter 30. The web pages had come from Randy and Judy Brown. They had warned the sheriff's department repeatedly about Eric for more than a year and a half. Sometime around noon, April 20th, the file was shuttled to the command center in a trailer set up in Clement Park. Jeffco officials quoted Eric's site extensively in the search warrants executed that afternoon, but then denied ever seeing it. They would spend several years repeating those denials. They suppressed the damning warrants as well. Then Sheriff Stone fingered Brooks as a suspect on the Today Show. It was a rough time for the Brown family. The public got 2 conflicting stories. Randy and Judy Brown had either labored to prevent Colulmbine or raised one of its conspirators, or both. To the Browns, it looked like retribution. Yes, their son had been close to the killers, close enough to see it coming. The Browns had blown the whistle on Eric Harris over a year earlier, and the cops had done nothing. After Eric went through with his threats, the Browns were fingered as accomplices instead of heroes. They couldn't believe it. They told the New York Times they had contacted the sheriff's department about Eric 15 times. Jeffco officials would insist for years that the Browns had never met with an investigator, despite holding a report indicating that they had. The officers knew they had a problem, and it was much worse than the Browns realized. 13 months before the massacre, sheriff's investigators John Hicks and Mike Guerra had investigated one of the Browns' complaints. They discovered substantial evidence that Eric was building pipe bombs. Guerra had considered it serious enough to draft an affidavit for a search warrant against the Harris home. For some reason, the warrant was never taken before a judge. Guerra's affidavit was convincing. It spelled out all the key components: motive, means, and opportunity. A few days after the massacre, about a dozen local officials slipped away from the feds and gathered clandestinely, that means in secret, in an innocuous office in the county open space department building. It would come to be known as the open space meeting. The purpose was to discuss the affidavit for a search warrant. How bad was it? What should they tell the public? Guerra was driven to the meeting and told never to discuss it outside that group. He complied. The meeting was kept secret too. That held for 5 years. March 22nd, 2004, Guerra would finally confess it happened to investigators from the Colorado Attorney General. He described it as, quote, one of those cover your ass meetings. District Attorney Dave Thomas attended the meeting. He told the group he found no probable cause for the investigation to have executed. He told the group he found no probable cause for the investigators to have executed the draft warrant, a finding ridiculed once it was released. He was formally contradicted by the Colorado Attorney General in 2004. At a notorious press conference 10 days after the murders, Jeffco officials suppressed the affidavit and boldly lied about what they had known. They said they could not find Eric's web pages, they found no evidence of pipe bombs matching Eric's descriptions, and they had no record of the Browns meeting with the Hicks. Guerra's affidavit plainly contradicted all three claims. Officials had just spent days reviewing it. They would repeat the lies for years. So there is number 12, which is a three-part question. Several days after the meeting, investigator Guerra's file on his investigation of Eric disappeared for the first time. The Cover Your Ass meeting was a strictly Jeffco affair, limited mostly to senior officials. Most of the detectives on the case, including the feds and cops from local jurisdictions, were unaware of the cover-up. They were trying to crack the case. Police detectives continued fanning out across Littleton. They had 2,000 students to interview, no telling where the truth might be tucked away. They all reported back to the leadership team in the Colulmbine band room. It was chaos. Guys were coming in with notes on scraps of paper and matchbook covers. At the end of the week, Kate Batten took control of the situation. She called everyone in the band room for a massive 4-hour debriefing and information exchange. At the end of the meeting, 3 crucial questions remained. How had the killers gotten all the guns? How had they gotten bombs into the school? And who had conspired to help them? Batten and her team had a good idea where the conspiracy lay. They had nearly a dozen chief suspects. They pitted 2 against each other. Chris Morris claimed he was innocent. Prove it, they said. Help us smoke out Duran. Chris agreed to a wiretap. On Saturday afternoon, he called Phil Duran from FBI headquarters in Denver, where federal agents listened in. They commiserated on how rough it had gotten. It's pretty crazy, man, Phil said. Yeah, the media is going psycho. Chris went for the kill too soon. He had heard Duran had gone out shooting with the killers and someone videotaped it. He mentioned the tape, but Duran brushed it off. For 14 minutes, they spoke. Chris kept circling back to it. Duran deflected as many times. I have no clue, dude, he said. Finally, Chris got an admission that Duran had been out shooting with Eric and Dylan. He got a name. The place was called Rampart Range. It didn't sound like much. It was leverage. On Sunday, an ATF agent, alcohol, tobacco, and firearms, paid Duran a visit. Duran told him everything. Eric and Dylan had approached him about a gun. He put them in touch with Mark Maines, who'd sold them the Tech 9. Duran admitted to relaying some of the money, but said he'd earned nothing on the deal. Every bit of that was true. 5 days later, detectives hauled Maines into ATF headquarters in downtown Denver with attorneys for defense and prosecution. Maines made a full confession. Duran had introduced him to Eric and Dylan on January 23rd at the Tanner Gun Show, the same place the killers had bought the 3 other guns. Duran identified Eric as the buyer, as he did the talking. Maines agreed to sell the gun on credit. Eric would pay $300 now and $200 more when he could raise it. It was Dylan who showed up at Maines' house that night. He handed over the down payment and picked up the gun. Duran delivered the $200 a couple of weeks later. Detectives asked Maines repeatedly about the killers' ages. Eventually, he admitted that he'd assumed they were under 18. Maines had bought the Tech 9 at the same show about 6 months earlier. He'd used his debit card. Later, he produced a bank statement showing he'd paid $491. He'd made $9 on the deal. It could cost him 18 years. There's your answer for number 13. Dr. Fuseli didn't think much about motive the first few days. It was kind of a moot point, and they had a conspiracy to rope in. Every minute, evidence could be vanishing. Alibis arranged, cover stories coordinated. But curiosity soon intruded and refused to be dented. His mind kept returning to the critical question of why? With nearly 100 detectives working the case, that central question largely fell to one. It began as a small part of Agent Fuseli's job. He was primarily concerned with leading the FBI team. He met daily with his team leaders. They briefed him, he asked questions, shot holes in their theories, suggested new questions, and challenged them to probe harder. He spent 8 to 10 hours a day leading that effort, and on Sundays he drove into Denver to sort through his inbox at FBI headquarters. He had to get up to speed on the federal cases he had handed off and offer insight and suggestions where he could. But he began to carve out a little time every evening to assess the killers. He had teams of people to assemble the data, but no one else was qualified to analyze it. He was the only psychologist on the team. He had studied this very sort of killer for years for the FBI, and he knew what he was up against. Even if it meant a few hours of extra work each night, he was going to understand these boys. It pissed him off watching them brag on video about the people they would maim. "You damn little jerks," he would hear himself mutter. But sometimes he felt a little sorry for them. Their point of view was indefensible, but he had to embrace it temporarily and empathize with them. If he refused to see the world through their lens, how would he have understood how they could do it? They were high school kids. How did they get this way? Dylan, in particular, what a waste. Fusilier's peers and subordinates were glad someone had taken on the informal role of chief psychologist. They had a lot of questions about the killers, and they needed someone to turn to, one person who deeply understood the perps. Fusilier quickly became known internally as the expert on the two boys. Kate Batten was leading the day-to-day investigation, and everyone deferred to her on logistical questions like who'd been running down a particular hallway at a certain moment during the attack. But Fusilier understood the perpetrators. He returned to Eric's journal over and over, and then Dylan's, poring over every line. About a week after the murders, Fusilier was introduced to the basement tapes and earlier footage Eric and Dylan had shot of themselves. He took the tapes home and watched them repeatedly. He hit the pause button frequently, advancing frame by frame, going back over revealing moments to dissect nuance. On the surface, much of the material was tedious and banal. Little snippets of daily life, like the boys making dumb high school jokes with Chris Morris in the car and bickering over the drive-thru order at Wendy's. Nothing even tangentially related to the murders appeared on most of those tapes. But Fusilier soaked up ordinary impressions of his murderers. Fusilier watched or read every word from the killers dozens of times. His big break came just a few days after the murders, before he saw the basement tapes. Fusilier heard an ATF agent quoting a ghastly phrase Eric Harris had written. "What you got there?" Fusilier asked. "A journal." For the last year of his life, Eric Harris had written down many of his plans in a journal. Fusilier zipped over and read the opening line. "I hate the fucking world." When I read that first sentence, all the commotion in the band room ended, he said later. I just zoned out. Everything else faded. Suddenly, the big bombs began to make a lot of sense. The fucking world. "That's not Brooks Brown," Fusilier said. "That's not the jocks. That is an all-pervasive hate." That is number 14. Fusilier read a bit further and then turned to the ATF agent. "Can I have a copy of this?" The pages had been photocopied from a spiral notebook, 16 handwritten pages and a dozen more of sketches and charts and diagrams. There were 19 entries, all dated, running from April 10th, 1998 to April 3rd, 1999, 17 days before Colulmbine. They ran a page or two at the beginning, then shortened considerably, with the last 5 crammed into the last page and a half. They were dark and fuzzy from too many trips through the copier. Eric's scrawl was hard to decipher at first, but Fusilier was reading again while the pages made another pass through the copy machine. It was mesmerizing, he said. The journal had told infinitely more than Eric's website had. The website, which predated the journal by at least a year, was mostly vented rage. It told us who he hated, what he wanted to do to the world, and what he had already done. It said very little about why. The journal was angry, but deeply reflective, and infinitely more candid about the urges driving Eric to kill. Fusilier read while the photocopies ran. He read on the walk back to the ATF agent's desk, and he stood there reading rather than return to his own chair. He didn't notice his back stiffening up for several minutes until the pain finally interrupted. Then he took a seat and kept reading. Holy shit, Fusilier thought. He's telling us why he did it. Eric would prove the easier killer to understand. Eric always knew what he was up to. Dylan did not. That is the end of part 2 and the end of chapter 30. Keep calm. English on, kids.